Hi everyone, it's Ileana and I have a couple of cards to share with you today. I am going to be using a couple of different stamp sets as well as a few different embossing folders. I started off by making this sample card, but I wanted to go back and recenter the sentiment a little bit lower so it's a little bit more pleasing to the eye. So I'm going to start off by showing you how I made the card. First, I'm going to take the sentiment and I'm going to try to line it up where I want it. Here is an extra wreath that I made, so I'm just going to get everything positioned onto this little transparency sheet. And by the way, you can download this for free off the website. I'll be sure to put a link in the description. Once I get it centered, I'm going to test it out to make sure that it is exactly centered and that it's lined up straight, because sometimes I can't line things up correctly. And once I have that, I'm going to do some embossing. So I went ahead and prepped my cardstock, and I am using this rustic cream cardstock from Paper Tray Ink. And I am stamping this with some Versafine Clair. I am using the Glamourous shade because I'm going to be using some red Wow embossing powder, and it's gold. It's called Red Glitz, I believe. I want to go ahead and heat set that, and once that's done, I'll be able to add the SHIPLAP to the background. The stamp comes from Concord and 9th, and so I'm just going to go ahead and position this. I'm going to go ahead and start at the top so that I know that every time I butt it up against the top edge of the MISTI that I know it's going to be centered. Really doesn't matter side to side because the stamp extends over the edges of the card. So I want to make sure, sometimes it's a little deceiving when you put your stamp onto the grid sheet, like the lines don't exactly go where you think they're going to go. So I'm just going to test it out with my transparency. I am just double checking to make sure that it is exactly where I want it to be. And I'm going to be using this Delicata dark brown shimmer pigment ink. I wanted to make it look like it's natural wood, so that was the only brown pigment ink that I had, so it just happens to be shimmery. I'm just going to move the cardstock down. It doesn't have to be exact or anything like that, but I'm just going to move it down, and you can stamp it twice and it should get the whole background. Once that's done, I'm going to add some of the icicle embossing powder from Brutus Monroe, and that should seal up and it won't smear my pigment ink. So I like doing this because it kind of speeds up the whole process. I don't have to worry about smearing the pigment ink, and it adds a little bit of texture to your card. So once that's all heated up, I'm going to move on to the next step, which is using that same shimmer pigment ink. I'm taking one of these smaller picket fence brushes and I'm just going around the edge to add a little bit of texture, make it kind of look a little weathered. I tried doing different colors of shading, but this is the one that worked out the best. It went well with the cream. If you feel like you got too much onto your cardstock, you can always try to rub some off. And here I got too much in this upper corner, so I'm just using my Mono Sand Eraser to remove some of that. It's just because pigment ink sits on top of the paper that you're able to do that. Now I did cut down some of the MISTI grid paper, and the reason why I did that is because I wanted to tape it down. I find that sometimes when I do die cuts that my paper shifts or it doesn't quite reach into the corner. So I don't want anything to shift because I am going to be stamping onto some dies. And so I just went ahead and used my purple tape to hold everything down. I'm going to start off by stamping the image from the Magnolia Wreath stamp set from Concord and 9th. I did use Gina K's Grass Green for this, and what I did was I took the negative part of the die cut and I'm just centering it over the stamped image that I put onto the grid paper, and this way I could line everything up pretty easily. Once I get it all lined up, I'm just going to add some purple tape, and that way I could just stamp several of these at one time just by popping in the die cut into the negative piece. Once I get that done, I can use a little craft pick to pop it out and then just go to the next one, and you can do several of these at one time. Once I have this completely stamped out, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn my MISTI over just so that I could see it a little bit better, and I'm going to take another negative die cut and I'm going to line it up, and I want to line it up so that when I get done with one, I can just move the piece up, not have to worry about which rotation the Magnolia is. It makes it just a little bit more efficient. So I'm going to tape down that die cut again, and I'm not stamping the step 2 to this because you need to have step 1 stamped on your piece. And so now I'm lining it up. Now I am having trouble seeing, so I'm going to take all of the images off the backer sheet. I'm going to set those stamps aside, and then I'm going to take the imaging sheet and I'm going to line it up so that I can line up my stamp. So once I figure out where this goes, I'm trying to see which way it is. Now I'm going to put a little bit of purple tape down just so that it doesn't shift on me. It's just temporary. Okay, now that I have it lined up, I'm going to put my stamp right over it, and it's a lot easier to line it up because of the black print on the backer sheet. So I'm going to pick up the stamp, and then I'm going to remove that backing sheet from my MISTI. Once I have it all lined up, I want to double check because everything shifts when you pick up the stamp, so I want to double check. So I am making sure that everything is lined up, and I did use a pigment ink just so that it's easier to clean up off my stamp. So it is lined up, so now I'm going to go ahead and do my second layer of stamping. And I like to stamp so that the lid is on the right hand side because I ink with my right hand side, so I'm going to rotate this back. So once I get everything done, I'm going to pop in my stamps, and now I'm going to be using the Simon Says stamp Willow. Now I don't remember, but I think I wanted the willow darker, so I think I actually go back later and I double stamp the willow just so that it appears to be more of a contrast. It looks fine here, but when you let the ink dry, it kind of fades back a little bit, so I did do it twice. Now here I am adding some embossing powder so that I am able to, nope, that's where I was stamping it twice. So now I'm going to be adding some embossing powder so that I can, I'm going to be using embossing ink so that I can add embossing powder to it. So it will make it a little bit shiny just so that it looks like actual greenery. I'm using that clear embossing powder, the Icicle embossing powder from Brutus Monroe, and I'm going to heat set it. I'm just using a piece of cardboard. It's the cardboard from a finished watercolor tablet, and so it's kind of thick, so it'll protect my cutting board, my cutting mat. Now I'm going to stamp the sentiment, and I'm going to be using that same brown shimmer Delicata ink, the dark brown, and I do need to stamp this a couple of times, and because I stamped it so many times, I went ahead and heat set it. I also fussy cut it, so it doesn't come with the die. Now here's something that you hardly ever see me do. I'm using an acrylic block. I get so nervous when I use acrylic blocks because there's always one that never turns out quite right, and then I'm always too chicken to line it up, so I just leave it alone. So I'm adding my Wow embossing powder, and especially when you're stamping on a slick surface like embossing ink, it kind of makes it slide just a little bit. So I always get nervous. So once everything's heat set, I'm going to go ahead and cut out the center of my stamp. I'm sorry, the center of my stamped image, just so that you could see the wreath. It does come with this little centerpiece that you can cut out. Okay, once everything's cut out, now I am able to mount it onto the front of my card. Now I have to figure out which way the wreath goes just so that the sentiment can go straight across. And I don't recall which way because there is part of the image that the wreath is thicker and I want it to look natural on the card front. So I'm just kind of rotating things around trying to figure out which way I had it. So for this next sample, I'm going to be using the ALTENEW Peaceful Wreath stamp set, and it's basically the same thing. So I'm just going to show you the first part just so that you could see what I did. I lined up everything like I did on the Magnolia wreath, but the only difference between this stamp set and the Magnolia wreath is that you only get half of the wreath. So basically you have to stamp out your wreath one time, which I'm going to do right here. And then once you get that done, you're going to pop it out and you're going to rotate it and stamp the other side of the wreath. And you do that for all of the steps. You do have more layers on the ALTENEW stamp set, but instead of showing you each layer, I'm just going to show you the beginning. And that is basically it. Now for the background, I'm going to be using this Tailored Expression brick embossing folder. And I found that if I use the magnetic shim in my Gemini that I get a really good impression, and so you get this beautiful embossed background. Now for the little sub-sentiment on this card, I am just taking a small strip of vellum. I did prep it with my anti-static embossing powder. That way when I go to add my embossing powder, it doesn't stick where it's not supposed to. So I'm just stamping this with some Ink on 3 embossing ink, and I'm just sliding that panel, that vellum, up and down the MISTI just so that I could get multiple images. Once I have that done, I'm going to go ahead and use some gold embossing powder, and I'm going to brush away any stray embossing powders. Now because the vellum is so flimsy, I'm going to take 2 tweezers and I'm just going to hold it down. That way it's not flopping all over the place and I can heat set this. Once it's all heat set, I'm able to trim my pieces down. I'm just going to take a little bitty cutting mat and I'm going to take my cut-a-line. I'm going to start off by trimming off the edge pieces because then I can do all of them all in one swoop. So I'm just going to line up everything with the 1/8 line and I'm just going to run down my blade down the cutting portion of my cut-a-line. So once that's done, I'm able to trim off the extra pieces, and now I can go through and cut all of my little sub-sentiments down and they will be all exactly the same size. I like to start trimming my pieces on the bottom of the sentiment because it's where it has the most words that touch the bottom line. And so that way I know that it's completely straight. So I'm just going to do all of the pieces at the same time. And then what I'll do is once I get done, I will start cutting from the other side. Now it's a little bit trickier on the other side because the H kind of throws everything off. So what I'm doing is I am just lining up the line with the top of most of the words. And then I just leave a little bit of room for the top of the H. So I hope that makes sense. So I'm just going to go ahead and continue trimming all of these pieces out. So here are the cards that I made. I did lose part of my footage, the part where I add on the piece and on earth, how I did those, but you can kind of get the gist of it. Here is the one with the brick. I made another one with the Tailored Expression bead board. And here is one with the SIZZIX 3D embossing folder. And this is with Tailored Expression's wood grain background. So thanks so much for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed this video. Be sure to give it a thumbs up and don't forget to hit that subscribe button, and I hope you have a great day.